The Black Wolf's Destiny. The cold winds sliced through the skin, carrying with them the musty smell and the soulless chill of the dark night. The pale moonlight seeped through the tightly shut windows, casting a glow on the cold stone floor of the Ravendell orphanage, the place that imprisoned those cast aside by society. Here, a rogue wasn't just a title, it was a life sentence, an inscription of a cursed fate. Lyra bent over, her trembling hand scrubbing fiercely at the layer of dust that had accumulated on the stone floor. The knuckles of her hands were swollen, the back of her tattered shirt exposing scars, some healed over, others still fresh, red and swollen from the recent lashings. The wooden brush in her hand had worn down so much that the bristles were now stiff and ragged. But Vadra wouldn't care. She didn't care about anything, as long as the rogues were still bowing before her like tamed wild animals. "Hurry up!" a shrill voice rang out, followed by the heavy sound of footsteps. "I don't want to see a speck of dust." Celine, Lyra's only true friend in this hell, gripped the brush tightly in her hand. She didn't resist, didn't argue. Her empty eyes gazed down at the cold stone floor, her cracked lips pressed tight as though trying to swallow the pain within. Vadra stepped forward, her narrow eyes gleaming with amusement as she watched Lyra shiver. Exhausted again? The rogues are so weak. Without warning, she cracked the whip. The sharp sound of it echoed through the room, leaving a bright red mark across Lyra's back. No one said anything. No one dared speak. Lyra bit her lip until it bled, tears streaking down her gaunt face. Vadra merely scoffed and turned away. The children of Ravendell had no dreams. They only had wounds, hunger, and the fear of being left in a world that didn't want them. No one helped them. No one cared whether they lived or died. But death, Lyra had once thought that would be her release. Until the decree from the Alpha Commander was issued. All rogues would be executed by the age of 18. Celine had only one more night. Tomorrow morning, when the sun rose, she would be dragged to the execution ground, shackled like a hunted beast. And Lyra, whether she wanted it or not, knew her fate was sealed. She only had 2 months before it was her turn. Celine leaned against the cold stone wall, her breath heavy. "Do you think there's somewhere for us, Lyra? Somewhere we won't be treated like the scum of the earth?" Lyra didn't answer. She couldn't afford to dream. Dreams only brought pain when they shattered. But the light of hope still flickered in Celine's eyes, a faint gleam of light amidst the endless darkness. "Tomorrow, I won't be here anymore," Celine said, her voice trembling, but not with fear. "I just hope you find a way to survive. Lyra, you're stronger than you think." Lyra clenched her fists. She wanted to protest, wanted to say that Celine wouldn't die, that they would escape. But the truth was, there was no way out. They had nowhere to go. Outside the walls of the orphanage, the wolves' howls echoed through the night. A sign for those without a pack. A funeral song for Celine, and one day, it would be for Lyra too. Under the darkened sky, the bonfire blazed, casting light on the execution ground, where dozens of eyes watched the fate of the condemned. In the tense atmosphere, with the stench of blood lingering on the ground, the two young girls were bound tightly, their heads bowed in despair. The cries for justice from the crowd made the air even more suffocating. The sky above was thick with an oppressive gray, signaling an approaching storm. In the forest surrounding the Alpha Commander's territory, the air was heavy with the scent of blood and tension. The sound of the execution drum rang out, each heavy beat pounding in the chests of the witnesses, as if drowning them in the cruelty of fate. In the cold plaza, Lyra and Celine were bound tightly, their faces pale, but their eyes still shining with defiance. The Alpha Commander arrogantly stood at the top of the platform, his voice booming in the wind. Rogues must be eradicated. They are a danger, a plague to the wolf world. Hundreds of eyes in the crowd watched, some with malicious glee, others with bowed heads in fear. No one dared stand against him, for the laws here never had exceptions. But then, the atmosphere suddenly changed. A cold gust swept through, as if an unseen force had descended, its pressure so strong that everyone could feel it. The Alpha Commander's wolf froze, its feet trembling, though it didn't understand why. The warriors around them gripped their weapons instinctively, but none had the courage to advance. From afar, the figure of a knight riding a jet-black steed approached. He wasn't accompanied by a retinue, nor did he need a trumpet to announce his arrival. Only the absolute silence enveloped the area, and a crushing pressure, as if death itself had set foot on the battlefield. Kane Draven, the king of the Steel Dynasty, a man who had never cared for the world of chaotic wolf packs, now stood here. His sharp eyes swept across the scene, not hiding his disdain as he witnessed this spectacle. But what made him pause was something strange. Lyra's silver eyes met his. In an instant, something stirred within Kane, an inexplicable feeling, something primal, wild, and dangerous. But he pushed it aside. Kane dismounted, taking heavy steps toward the execution grounds, undeterred by the fearful and stunned gazes surrounding him. His voice, deep yet resonant, echoed, "Stop!" The Alpha General raised an eyebrow, though concern was evident on his face. This is none of the Steel Dynasty's business. Kane narrowed his eyes, the authority of a king enveloping the space. "You're wrong. Those under 18 cannot be executed according to the laws of the Steel Dynasty. If you kill them, you are challenging me." A terrifying silence filled the air. The warriors of the Alpha General trembled and stepped back, for they all knew what this meant. When Kane Draven spoke, anyone who dared defy him would never have the chance to regret it. Lyra stared at Kane, her heart in turmoil with an inexplicable mix of emotions. This man, he is dangerous. He carries an overwhelming presence, but there's also something strangely magnetic about him. As for Kane, he found himself reacting in a way he could not accept. A king should not have a mate who is a lowly rogue. It was impossible. But why? When her eyes met his, did he feel a desperate need to protect her at all costs? Night fell as Kane Draven's army entered the territory of the Steel Dynasty. Unlike the chaotic lands of wild wolf packs, this place exuded a harsh order, a land built on discipline and blood. Towering castles rose from the darkness, the flickering light from high watchtowers reflecting off the shining steel armor of the guards. The silence here was not one of peace, but of an invisible pressure, a reminder that the weak had no place in this kingdom. Lyra was yanked off her horse, her legs giving way to the cold stone floor as the massive gates opened. She no longer had the strength to resist, unsure of where she was being led or what her fate would be. Celine clung tightly to her, but neither of them had any answers. They only knew one thing. They were still alive, at least for now. Cold. Sharp gazes followed their every step as they were escorted down the main road of the fortress. The warriors in heavy steel armor watched silently, some curious, some contemptuous. A rogue, a lowly wanderer brought here by Kane Draven, the undefeated king. Rumors would soon spread across the kingdom, and no one could predict what would happen next. When they were brought to the Grand Hall, the Royal Wolf Council was already waiting. These were Kane's right-hand men, powerful leaders in the dynasty, and the enforcers of the kingdom's strictest laws. They eyed Lyra with skepticism, as if trying to discern her worth in this power game. "Kane, you really brought a rogue?" One of them spoke, his tone cautious. "We have never sheltered such individuals." Lyra felt the coldness in the air much. She wasn't surprised. A mighty dynasty like this had no place for the weak, especially someone of her lowly status. Kane paid no heed to the probing gazes around him. He coldly swept his eyes over the figures standing before him, his voice deep, but carrying absolute strength. "They will remain here, under my supervision." No one dared to object, though some members of the council clearly showed their dissatisfaction. But none were foolish enough to challenge Kane Draven. He was not a king who could be manipulated by rumors or baseless judgments. He gave orders, and all had but one choice: to obey. Lyra didn't know how many days had passed since she was kept in this castle. Fitful sleep, eyes watching her every moment, made her feel more isolated than ever. She couldn't believe in her luck, for fate had never been kind to her. Kane had saved her, but he was no merciful hero. She couldn't understand why he protected her. The longer she stayed in this dynasty, the more she noticed something strange. Kane didn't treat her like others. He didn't humiliate her, didn't see her as beneath him, but neither did he give her a clear reason to trust him. And even stranger, whenever someone showed hostility or threatened her, Kane would always appear. She saw it in his eyes, something primal, intense, yet never named. He protected her, even though he himself didn't understand why. But Lyra didn't dare to believe. She had grown accustomed to being abandoned, to the cruelty of this world. She didn't allow herself to dream of such an easy change of fate. One day, Kane ordered her and Celine to join training. "You must learn to protect yourselves," he said, his gaze cold as ice. "Weakness has no place in this dynasty." His words weren't just aimed at Celine. They were a challenge for her as well. Lyra knew that, but she didn't foresee the hardships that awaited her. The wolf warriors of the Steel Dynasty were trained with the harshest exercises. Survival wasn't for the weak, and from the very first day, Lyra realized a bitter truth. she could not transform. Each time she tried to summon her wolf, something like shackles tightened around her from within. She felt pain, her body shaking as if being torn apart. Yet her wolf didn't appear. It was locked away. Every time she failed, the other trainers sneered, their mocking glances sweeping over her as though she were nothing but a joke. But Kane didn't laugh. He stood there, watching from a distance, his eyes darkening. Each time he saw her in pain, anger surged within him. He couldn't understand why this feeling was so strong. Why seeing her fail made him lose his composure. He shouldn't care, but he couldn't help but care. Lyra felt it too. But she still didn't dare to believe. She only knew that, in order to survive here, to not become a burden, she had to be stronger. No matter how many times Kane protected her, only she could decide her fate. And she swore that, no matter the cost, she would find a way to awaken the power within her. The blood-red moon hung over the sky, casting a dark crimson hue, like an ancient prophecy coming to life after centuries of silence. Its eerie light covered the forest, making every leaf take on a deathly color. No creature dared to make a sound. No wind dared to whisper through the trees. Only the dense atmosphere, thick with tension, as if even nature itself held its breath in anticipation. Kane stood before Lyra, his golden eyes glowing in the darkness. His voice was deep, carrying an unresistible authority. "Run!" Lyra looked at him, her breath ragged. She didn't understand why he had brought her here. Didn't understand the strange command. "Why?" she asked. But all she received in reply was an eerie silence. Kane took a step forward, his eyes darkening. "If you want to live, if you want to know who you truly are, then run. Don't resist." Fear rose within Lyra's chest, but instinct urged her to obey. She turned and ran straight into the forest, her feet swiftly moving across the cold earth. The darkness swallowed her, but the blood moon still watched from above, like a malevolent eye observing every step of the one about to awaken. Then the pain hit. It wasn't like anything she had felt before. Not the pain of being struck down on the battlefield. Not the agony of being crushed by the world. This was a deep, all-encompassing pain, as if every fiber of her being, every vein, every cell was both shattering and being reborn at the same time. Lyra collapsed, her nails digging into the wet earth. Her breath coming in, gasps. She had tried to resist it before, fought back every time her body reacted. But this time, she didn't. She let herself go with the pain. She let it guide her. And then, something shattered. A roar echoed, not the usual howl of a wolf, but a bellowing scream, as if the very soul of the night had been set free. Silver light flashed, the air trembled, and the ground itself seemed to shake under the rising power. When the pain faded, when the fragments of her old soul were swept away, Lyra stood, but she was no longer herself. The pure black fur covered her body, not the usual gray fur of rogue wolves, nor the color of those from noble bloodlines. This was something forgotten by legend, a pure black, shimmering with cold silver streaks. Like a star in the endless darkness, her eyes burned bright, no longer just silver, but imbued with a mystical light of a power that no one could deny. A dark wolf. A true black wolf. And there was only one bloodline in history to carry this blood. The descendants of the Black Wolf bloodline. An ancient royal family that had been wiped from history hundreds of years ago. Kane stood frozen, looking at the creature before him with eyes that he couldn't even believe. He had suspected for a long time, had sensed something unusual about Lyra. But he never considered this possibility. She was not a rogue. She was not a worthless outcast. She was the last descendant of a bloodline that had vanished from history. A bloodline that even kings like him had to respect. Was it Lyra who realized this first? Or had her body always known this truth? In that moment, Kane felt something inside him shatter as well. He couldn't deny what he had been denying all this time. It wasn't just curiosity. It wasn't just simple attraction. It wasn't pity. Lyra was his mate. A cold wind swept through the forest, carrying the breath of a fate long ago sealed. Kane clenched his fist, feeling his heart waver for the first time. It couldn't be. But everything had become crystal clear. The darkness enveloped the forest as the blood moon slowly faded. The sky now wore a cold, silvery hue. But the aftershocks of what had just happened still echoed in the air. Lyra stood there, in her new form. Her breath ragged as she felt the surge of power flowing through her veins. Her wolf was no longer locked away. It had awakened, growling deep within her subconscious, proud and wild, carrying a dominance that she herself couldn't fully understand. But she wasn't the only one changing. Kane stood only a few steps away from her, his golden eyes darkening, like a storm brewing within his mind. He said nothing, but his silence was more terrifying than any command. Lyra could feel the heavy breaths he took, the internal struggle that trapped him in his own denial. He knew. He had known from the very first moment he saw her. But he had tried to deny it. Kane Draven, the undefeated king of the Steel Dynasty, a man who had never bowed before any power, was now fighting against his own fate. He wanted to refuse what his instincts had etched into his soul. But each time he looked at Lyra, every cell in his body howled to affirm a single truth. She was his mate. He couldn't escape. The night breeze stirred the trees, carrying her scent, a distinctive fragrance, unlike anyone else's, making every vein in Kane's body burn with desire. He clenched his fist, trying to hold on to his reasoning. But then he stepped forward, slowly but surely, like a predator who had accepted his own instincts. Lyra still didn't understand what was happening. She instinctively stepped back, her eyes filled with confusion as Kane drew closer, the tension between them thickening. He stood before her, towering and overwhelming, his eyes aflame as if wanting to burn everything in their path. "You are my mate." His low voice thundered in Lyra's mind like a clap of thunder. She froze. No, it couldn't be. She shook her head, trying to push away the rising feeling in her chest. No, I can't be your mate. I'm a rogue. I can't be yours. Her voice trembled, but not out of fear. Rather because she too felt something awakening within her, a truth she didn't want to accept. Kane tilted his head slightly, his sharp eyes seeming to pierce through every denial she spoke. "You think I want this?" He chuckled softly, but there was no joy in it, only helplessness and anger. "You think I want a mate who cannot protect herself? A girl I once thought useless?" His words cut through Lyra's heart like a knife. But then his voice softened, heavy and warm. "But no matter how much I deny it, the truth remains unchanged." He looked directly at her, his golden eyes burning like molten lava. "I can kill thousands of enemies. I can rule the dynasty with iron and steel, but I cannot defeat fate." Lyra opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her heart raced, every vein in her body reacting to every word Kane spoke. Mate. Her soul trembled at the word. A mate was not just a lover or partner. It was the most sacred bond between two wolves. It was an unbreakable connection, something neither of them could deny for the rest of their lives. And if Kane was right, then she belonged to him. No, she couldn't accept this. She turned, intending to run. But a strong arm reached out, grabbing her wrist and pulling her back. "Look at me," Kane commanded, his voice rough. Lyra couldn't resist. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, everything shattered. The connection between them was no longer a declaration. It was a raging wave crashing through her, tearing down every defense. A shock ran through her body, making her tremble as she felt more clearly than ever before. He was hers, and she was his. The moonlight shone down, as white as a vow from the heavens. Kane bent down, his eyes no longer filled with just determination, but also something gentler, something even he couldn't fully understand. "You are not just my mate." His voice was warm, almost pleading. "An oath. You are my queen." His words struck deep into Lyra's heart, leaving her motionless. A girl once seen as useless, a rogue unacknowledged by anyone, was now called the Queen of the Steel Dynasty. She didn't know what awaited her in the future. She didn't know where fate would take her. But when Kane bent down and pulled her into a deep, possessive kiss, she knew that her life had changed forever. That kiss was not just a mark. It was a declaration, a binding. It was the acceptance of both souls. From that moment on, they were no longer strangers. They were one. The darkness covered the kingdom like a thick velvet curtain. Yet it couldn't hide the fire that had been ignited within the hearts of two individuals standing at the crossroads of fate. The silver moon hung high above, casting its light over the forest where everything had changed forever. Lyra stood there, the night wind sweeping through her hair, bringing a chill that couldn't calm the storm inside her. For the first time in her life, she looked at herself and no longer felt lost, no longer abandoned, no longer regarded as weak. Now, she knew who she was. Not an unknown rogue, not a wandering soul without roots. She was the last descendant of the Black Wolf bloodline. And more than that, she was Kane Draven's mate, the king of the Steel Dynasty. This truth was no longer a far-off prophecy or a foolish tale. It was reality, flowing through every vein in her body, roaring in her soul, engraved into every cell. She could no longer turn her back on it. But accepting fate didn't mean the road ahead would be easy. Kane stood not far from her, his gaze burning through the night around them. He didn't speak much, but each breath he took, every slight movement of his body, conveyed his determination. Lyra knew that from this moment on, he wouldn't let her go anywhere. No one, no power, could tear them apart. "What are you thinking?" Kane's low voice broke the silence. Lyra took a deep breath. She turned to face him, no longer hesitating. "I think my path forward doesn't only have you in it." Kane narrowed his eyes slightly, waiting for her to continue. "I am not just your mate, not just a queen destined by fate. I want to become myself. I want to understand the strength within me, and I want to fight for myself. Not just for you, but for me." Kane was silent for a moment, and then a smile appeared on his lips. Not a mocking smile. Not the usual sarcasm from someone as hard-edged as him. This was recognition. "Then I will wait." He stepped closer, lifting her chin with his hand, forcing her to look directly into his fiery eyes. "I will wait for the day you can fight beside me, as a true queen." Lyra didn't blink. She could feel the sincerity in his voice, though it still carried an undeniable possessiveness. But until then, Kane leaned closer, his warm breath on her skin, his voice a low growl like an oath. "I will protect you at all costs." A strange tremor ran through Lyra's chest as she heard those words. It wasn't weakness. It was acceptance. She was no longer alone, but she knew the challenge ahead wouldn't be simple. From afar, the howls of wolves echoed, a long and chilling sound coming from the far lands beyond the borders. It wasn't just the wind moving. There were enemies, shadows lurking, waiting for a chance to destroy everything they had just found. Lyra could feel the danger drawing near, an unknown threat sneaking through the night. She looked towards the distant horizon, where flickering lights signaled turmoil. Someone was watching. A force didn't want her to live peacefully. Kane also sensed it. He didn't turn his head, but every muscle in his body tensed, his breath deepening. His instincts had never been wrong. Danger was near. And this time, he wasn't the only target. "Our first trial is about to begin. My queen," Kane whispered softly, his voice both a warning and a promise. Lyra clenched her fist, the fire in her chest burning fiercely. She was ready. Whatever awaited them ahead, she would not step back. Thank you for staying with us and listening to today's story. Lyra and Kane's journey still holds many challenges ahead, and unexpected developments are sure to follow. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe to Moonlit West Tales, so you won't miss the next episodes. See you tomorrow with more thrilling developments.